Dave, at least you know what's going on. I look in the parlor.
Or out front, maybe. He was gonna, yeah, either place.
Bill's out front.
Good morning. Welcome to our service from the Unitarian Society of Northampton and Florence. I'm Jenny Furinger, and I am the worship liaison for this service. It is wonderful to see you all here this morning in the Great Hall and online. Thank you to everyone who is helping make the service happen this morning. If you are new or returning after a time away, we're very glad you're here. Feel free to fill out a blue welcome card, which you can put in the offering plate later in the service. There is also an online version that you'll find through the link in the chat. We'll put you on our email list so you can receive information about all our activities. We are happy to welcome Representative Lindsay Sabadosa to our service this morning. Representative Sabadosa represents the 1st Hampshire District in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. First elected in 2018, she is the first woman to hold this seat. Her past experiences include working on improving healthcare in the European Union, founding and managing a company for 17 years which specialized in Italian and French legal and financial translation with a focus on international litigation, contract law, and finance. Serving on the board of Emerge Massachusetts, which works to increase the number of Democratic women leaders from diverse backgrounds in public office, the board of the Abortion Rights Fund of Western Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Organizing Committee for Medicare for All. In February 2017, she helped create the Pioneer Valley Women's March, which has gone on to organize dozens of community events on a variety of social justice issues with particular focus on involving the community in state-level advocacy. You are invited to stay for a question and answer session in the Great Hall and on Zoom after the service. There will be no Zoom social hour today. We strive to be a congregation that welcomes people of all ages, races, religious beliefs, backgrounds, sexual orientations, gender identities, and abilities. We belong to the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, and we are guided and inspired by its values and principles. Our values and principles move us to remember that we in Northampton inhabit unceded land of the Pecumtuck and Nipmuc peoples. They remind us to acknowledge our responsibility to face the legacies of dispossession and systemic racism that are part of our collective history, even as we also affirm and celebrate the legacies that inspire us. We're here to celebrate, to reflect, and to support one another in sustaining hope and upholding our values. If you are on Zoom, we ask that you please keep your videos off except during the greeting. And if you're in the Great Hall, you don't have to wear a mask anymore. We have to take that line out. And now we'll begin our service.
Thank you, Ellen. That was beautiful. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming this morning and for many people who have been involved in making this service possible. It's been a collaboration between a lot of our social justice work here at the church, and you will see a number of different people in the pulpit this morning. So thanks everybody and all the tech team for making this possible. I'm Susie McCrae, and I'm a member of the USNF The Vote steering team. And just a little history on this service. It came about when the steering team was considering the question, how can we help shine the light on what's going on locally with issues of democracy and voting rights? Two thoughts immediately came to mind. First, let's invite our wonderful representative to the State House, Lindsay Sabadosa, to share some thoughts and answer some questions. The second thought was that this is an opportunity to focus not only on democracy issues, but also on the other social justice issues that we're actively addressing as a congregation. In other words, racial justice and climate justice. Once we had those two ideas, the rest followed with ease and grace, and we're thrilled to be able to bring this service to you today. And if I invite everyone to rise and body your spirit for our chalice lighting, and then please remain standing for our first hymn. Every one of us can bring blessings. Every one of us can bring light. Every one of us can bring love. We light our chalice in gratitude for this community and for the blessings each one brings.
The story is Equality's Call, the story of voting rights in America by Deborah Deason. Our founders declared when our country began that consent of the governed was part of the plan. Okay. Through voting, elections, and representation, the voice of the people would strengthen our nation. In fact, though, for years, this great founding ideal was extended to some, and for others, not real. But we heard in the distance equality's call, a right's not a right till it's granted to all. The states set the rules about who got to vote, and your gender, your race, and your wealth were of note. White men with property went to the polls, but the rest of the people were left off the rolls. The dream of democracy wasn't yet true. There were changes to make. There was work still to do. But we heard growing clearer equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. The rules about wealth were the first thing to go. As more were enfranchised, their voices could grow. And a small group of voices was raising the fact that enslavement was wrong, an unspeakable act. Good people stood up for the truth that they knew. Abolition and suffrage were long overdue. We heard ever louder equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. There was war in our nation and slavery ended. Amendments were added, the franchise extended. Now more men could vote, at least so the law said, yet denial through taxes and tests was widespread. And the voices of women were mostly omitted. In only some states was their voting permitted. But nothing could muffle equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. Suffragists didn't give up on the fight, and the 19th Amendment gave women the right. But voters of color still met with oppression. Their voting was hindered by brutal suppression. So we passed legislation to make voting fair, to extend and protect voters' rights everywhere. We heard it, we felt it, equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. The journey's not over, the work hasn't ended. Democracy's dream must be constantly tended. But where we are now is a debt that we owe to the work of more people than ever will know. And each time we vote, we acknowledge that past. We honor our rights to ensure they will last. For to vote is to answer equality's call. And each time we vote with them all.
Now please rise in body or spirit to sing The Fire of Commitment, hymn number 1028 in the teal hymnal.
Thank
greeting. Let's see. It's now time for us to greet one another. Those of you in the Great Hall, please wave to the camera in the back, to those on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, you're invited to turn on your videos, wave and say hello in the chat. It's helpful to switch to gallery view. Anyone online or here in person who is new or newish would like to, please say hello and tell us where you're from. Good morning to you on Zoom. Hello, Kirby. Hi, Julie. Hi, Claire. Hi, Kit. Hello, Evelyn and Gil. Hi, Kim Henryshan. Hi, Sally Weiss. Hello, Robbie. Hi, Evelyn. Hello, Gail. Sherry. Eric, hello. Margaret, that's Peggy. Alan Dorman, Janet Clark. Steve O'Day on Zoom. Sally Lawton. Ellen James. Nancy Berggren. Kim. Laura Schroeder. Rich West, hello. Melissa Bollock. Catherine M. John and Gail. Linda Adams, Justina, and Nancy. Welcome. Good to see you all. It has been good to see everyone. Please remember, if you're on Zoom, to turn off your videos. And now it's time for anyone going to religious education activities to leave us. Please join in humming or singing them out.
Okay. This reading is from Krista Tippett's March 30th interview with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a leader in today's abolitionist movement. Here's what Dr. Gilmore had to say. A group of women in East LA who designated themselves Mexican American learned that the state of California was planning to put a new prison in their community. They said, "We don't want this. Let's get busy." They organized themselves, they persisted, and they eventually won. But the mothers were not satisfied in winning the fight against that building. They wondered why the government of California presumed that children like their kids were going to fill that prison, because that was the excuse for putting the prison in their community. So they learned that a lot of people in prison had very modest educational attainment, and they learned that that was because a lot of them missed school. And they decided to find out, well, why do people miss school? And discovered that a lot of kids miss a lot of school because of asthma. And that's just like we have in Springfield. So they became environmental justice organizers, really, almost before environmental justice was a term of art and a term of politics. Fighting to reduce the amount of pollution that sweeps across the area of Los Angeles where they live, because it's close to freeways. And the freeways are carrying diesel trucks 24/7 with products from LA distributed across the US. They get to us. Those mothers did before we, and this is Ruth Gilmore Wilson Gilmore, for we, the abolitionists of this century, figured things out. They figured out how to think about what prison is made of besides some term like crime or criminals. So that's the key thing. We ask ourselves, like the mothers of East LA did, what is it about everyday life that makes people vulnerable? And what can we do in this democracy to address that?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrea Reber, member of the Racial Justice Team. David Ragland, co-founder of the Truth Telling Project, states, quote, "Reparations is a spiritual practice. Reparations is the midpoint between truth and reconciliation. In recent years, our congregation has been facing the truth about the legacies of slavery, and now we must move toward reparations. There's a current bill in the state Senate entitled An Act Establishing a Commission to Study Reparations in Massachusetts. 6 towns in Massachusetts have passed reparations initiatives, including Cambridge and Boston. In our area, Amherst has allocated $2 million over 10 years for reparations and has appointed the African Heritage Reparations Assembly to determine how these funds are spent. East Hampton has passed a resolution in support of the H.R. 40 bill in Congress. The Springfield NAACP has recently established a subcommittee to explore bringing a reparations initiative forward to its city council. And here in Northampton, the city council is now appointing residents to serve on the reparations commission that was called for in the resolution it passed back in February. There are 32 applicants for 11 positions on the commission, the majority of whom must be Black. It must also include a representative from the Human Rights Commission, the Youth Commission, the Northampton Reparations Committee, one of our local historical organizations, and 2 city councilors. The Reparations Commission is due to have its first meeting by June 15th, soon. What can you do? Attend meetings of the Reparations Commission and participate in its ongoing research into historical and current harms committed against Black people in Northampton. Get involved in Black organizations in Springfield and donate to them. Arise for Social Justice, Springfield, NAACP. Donate to National African American Reparations Commission, to National Coalitions of Blacks for Reparations in America, also known as NCOBRA, Grassroots Reparations Campaign. Your personal reparations can be a spiritual practice, a fulfillment of the 8th principle that we recently adopted. They are not charity. They are what you owe, what we all owe as beneficiaries of white privilege. It is time for us to humbly give it back. Thank you.
Our generosity makes everything we do possible, and it helps us support organizations and movements in the greater community. Half of the proceeds of each week's offering support the Society's operating budget, and half are shared outside our walls. The Coordinating Council never mind. Sorry. We've already selected organizations, and they're listed on the slides. You can mail in a check, donate online, or put your contribution in one of the plates that the ushers will pass. The offering will now be given and gratefully received.
This is not J.S. Butler.
This from Maya Angelou. I'm convinced of this. Good done anywhere is good done everywhere. For a change, start by speaking to people rather than walking by them like they're stones that don't matter. As long as you're breathing, it's never too late to do good. And from Mahatma Gandhi, you must not lose heart in humanity. Humanity is an ocean. If a few drops of the ocean become dirty, the ocean does not become dirty. We'll now have our meditation, so sit quietly.
For the reading this morning, we have 3 selections from the words of Nelson Mandela. I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended. He also observed, it always seems impossible until it is done. And finally, do not judge me by my successes. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again.
Thank you, Maude. And just a reminder that Lindsay is going to be with us to answer questions after the service. And now it is my great honor to introduce and welcome Lindsay Sabadosa here to join us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me here today and for allowing me to share some thoughts with you. It's truly a pleasure to be here in this space. Last week, a group of local individuals visited me at the State House. They were from the Hampshire County Food Policy Council, which is an organization that works to cultivate shared governance and a countywide network that builds the power of community to make food policies more equitable, honor diverse cultures, and help local food economies flourish. The members spoke to me about legislation they feel passionate about, creating food pantries on college campuses through the Hunger-Free Campus Bill, increasing money for the Healthy Incentives Program, which is a program that allows DTA card holders to purchase fresh produce directly from farmers and farmers markets up to their preset household limit without affecting their card balances, as well as funding requests to continue the grant program that supports their organization's work. And as the group was leaving to speak to other legislators, one of the members turned to me and said, "Please do everything in your power to help. We used our power to come here today and to share our stories. If we all use our power, we can accomplish something." Her comment struck me in so many ways. First, because it was truly heartfelt, which took all the stories she had shared and just elevated them, because I knew she wasn't just reciting something she'd been told to say. She really meant it. Second, though, she understood something that too many people have forgotten, that government is not a separate entity from the people. Her advocacy and her work, her use of her power, is why elected officials and members of the executive branch work to change statute and regulations so that our laws and rules fit better with the needs of the people for whom they were created. If I spent more time watching the news, I might feel a little more cynical. But I have the enormous privilege of hearing from individuals who know that only through engagement will we shift policy to align with the will of the people. People, power, policy, and politics are the 4 Ps that lead to change, but only if we remember that power is not just invested in elected officials or even just in a group of elected officials, but in all of us, who actively and full-throatedly reaffirm our commitments to democratic government and the people that it serves. Now, I might seem a little Pollyanna-ish, I admit. And if you know me personally, that is not the case. But it is important to reiterate that ideal of full and robust participation because it is essential to upholding our democracy. In Barbara Walter, not Barbara Walters, but Barbara Walter, in her book, How Civil Wars Start, she describes how fragile democracy is. Indeed, democracy in the United States has been at risk since the country's inception. Whether it was disputes between slave states versus free states, rural versus urban, states versus the federal government, democracy is at its core a shaky, imperfect form of government that evolves, expands and recedes, only to repeat the same patterns over and over. And at 200 years old, the United States is, by many counts, the oldest democracy in the world. And while it is constantly under threat, I have faith that it will continue despite those continued threats from those who might favor more autocratic confederacies to our current federal constitutional representative democracy. It's easy to lose faith when, though, I do understand, when those who win popular vote lose elections and parliamentary rules prohibit votes on issues of national importance, like voting rights. Still, I would argue that the greatest threat to democracy is not actually polarization or partisanship, which were clearly present from the founding of the country, racism or white supremacy, which is so widespread that it was actually built right into our founding documents, or even the removal of rights and liberties, because we've constantly removed rights and liberties from people to give more powers to others, again, since early days. The greatest threat to democracy is apathy, because democracy can only exist if the electorate participates. Now, elections are the purview of the states. The secretaries of state print ballots, and states set rules for statewide elections. States also, in accordance with the US Constitution, draw district lines, dividing states up into districts and wards to determine who will vote in which areas and with what cohort. In the State House, the walls are lined with portraits of the governors. If you ever come in, you see lots of white men. Those are all the governors. Going back to those appointed by the British Crown from 1620 on. And if you are by the elevator bank on the second floor in the West Wing, you will see a portrait of Governor Gerry. Now, Governor Gerry became very famous for his actions, which led to the creation of the word gerrymandering. And in 1812, Governor Gerry approved maps to keep his party in power, creating a district that looked like a salamander. And history was made by combining his name with Mander. And unfortunately for his legacy, the word stuck around, although it's likely he was the first person to consolidate power to keep his party in power, and unfortunately he wasn't the last. Indeed, in the 2020 redistricting brought court challenges across the nation, and Massachusetts, out of all of those dark spots on the map, remained a bright one, because we had successfully created districts that had avoided gerrymandering. The Center for Public Integrity even gave us an A+ rating, which is not something we see a lot. Interestingly, though, in the 2020 redistricting, 33 majority-minority districts were created, and in the 2021 elections, many of those seats actually went to people of color, just something to celebrate. There's also a warning sign when we look at those districts, and the warning sign is voter turnout. A little over half of Massachusetts residents voted in the 2022 midterm elections, but in the state's poorest municipalities, voter turnout was well below the state average. In cities with high poverty, like Lynn, New Bedford, Lawrence, no more than 35% of voters cast their votes in the elections. Meanwhile, in communities like Eastham, Carlisle, and Mount Washington, over 70% of voters did. This is the problem before us in the state of Massachusetts. Why does such low voter turnout persist, and what can we do about it? I would argue that this is not just a policy question before us. This is a fundamental question that we must answer if we want to retain democracy, the democracy that we have in this country, because without voter engagement, we cannot call ourselves a democracy, and autocratic forces will seep through those cracks. This may seem like a non sequitur, but when I go home after this, I'm going to put my keys by the door of my house. It's convenient and it's easy, and I always put them in the same place. And I submit that while that seems like a non sequitur, it's actually very much related to this topic, because human behavior often leans into what is easiest and most convenient. So if we want voting to feel natural, As setting your keys into that same place every time you enter your house, we have to make it that way. And that means enacting provisions that make it easier to vote. Now, I will tell you, we have tried to do this to some extent, and we did pass the Votes Act, which allows for permanent mail-in voting. It also mandates 2 weeks, including 2 weekends of early voting for biennial state elections, and it enshrines 1 week, including 1 weekend of early voting for presidential or state primary elections. And in an effort to increase voter participation, it also allows voters to vote up to 10 days before an election, compared to the current, what we had before, which was 20 days. Now, we also included in that provisions to try to help those who are incarcerated access the ballot. Sadly, however, I submit that this wasn't enough. And there's a lot more that we need to do. And the first thing that I want to talk about here today is same-day voter registration, or election day voter registration. I also have to apologize. I never print out speeches, so this is very awkward for me. I hope you can all bear with me. I usually make things up as I go, but it didn't feel like I should do that today. So we'll go back. The current regulations on voter registration are, in a word, arbitrary. This really hit home for me back in 2016. I had to renew my license, so I drove up to Greenfield to the RMV, and I was waiting there to get that renewal. And a man came in who had just moved to the state of Massachusetts, and he wanted to register to vote. And he said to the woman behind the counter, "This is the most important election I'm ever going to vote in my lifetime, and I need to make sure I can vote." And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. You're within the blackout period. You can't register to vote." And so even though there were no other provisions, simply due to state law, this man was precluded from participating in a presidential election in 2016. I believe that there are people in Massachusetts who spend more time worrying about paying their bills or getting their kids to school or doing any other thing than they do about updating their registration and their address with the RMV. And this is why same-day or election day voter registration is going to matter so much. Because no one should be turned away from the polls because they were unable to register during that blackout period. No one should be turned away and, which is current practice, sent to their previous polling place, which could be hours away, or across state lines to vote on election day. And no one should have to cast a provisional ballot that may actually never be counted, when they could just instead update incorrect information or their address right there at the polls, something that we can do with the poll books we have. So if we're going to move forward as a state, same day or election day registration is the best way we can do to make voting easy and convenient for people who flex their political muscle, and in doing so, create a habit. There is also another way that Massachusetts can expand voting rights, and that's through protecting the rights to vote for our incarcerated community members. So a little bit of history. More than 40 years ago, in O'Brien v. Skinner, the Supreme Court affirmed that states cannot deny eligible incarcerated voters access to the ballot simply because they're incarcerated. Yet, every election cycle, eligible voters in Massachusetts did not or could not vote while incarcerated. And as in all states, even though Massachusetts allows people who are over the age of 18, who are being held pretrial, or who have been held on a misdemeanor, or who are sectioned for civil commitment, they actually do have the right to vote. However, these citizens have a fundamental democracy issue. The right to vote that they have on paper is not maintained in practice, and that affects thousands of people in our state. And what we found is when people can vote, when civic participation is allowed, it reduces the likelihood of arrest, and it protects, and protecting and promoting access to the ballot is indeed something that, therefore, protects public safety. Isn't that a weird loop? And so while the Votes Act did try to make this a little bit easier, Massachusetts still has work to do in this realm, because we, like other states, preclude convicted felons, so not people on misdemeanors, but on felony charges, from voting. So we heard that the court said that you can't simply preclude, But the Supreme Court also gave an opening for states to say if it is a felony charge, you can preclude without violating the 14th Amendment. And Massachusetts for a long time didn't do that. We left the rule as it was. But what happened in our prisons is that people began to organize. Now, I have visited every prison in the state of Massachusetts. It is the right of an elected official to do so, because it's important for me to understand what it looks like behind the walls of a prison and what people are experiencing and why people are incarcerated, right? If we're going to reduce incarceration, we can't do it without actually finding out how people got there. And people in prison like to organize. They like to research. I left Norfolk Prison last week with actual law review articles that incarcerated individuals had given me in their research about ways they thought the law could be improved and bettered. And so it was very striking to me that the reason Massachusetts took away the right of people convicted of a felony to vote was by ballot initiative. And the reason the ballot initiative in the year 2000 came forward was because prisoners organized and decided they wanted to form a political action committee. Lots of people formed those, right? They wanted to organize a political action committee that would share how legislators were voting on issues that mattered to them, and would also encourage people who are incarcerated to exercise their right to vote, as well as their families outside of prison. So just let me repeat that. They wanted people who already had the vote to exercise their right to use it, as well as their families, and they wanted to share information about how legislators were voting on issues that mattered to them. In response to that, the governor of Massachusetts announced that we were going to have a ballot initiative to take that right away. And so in the 2000 election, people who were able to vote on the question found that their rights were removed. That's a really sad statement, isn't it? And so the good news is that in Massachusetts, we're trying to organize to get this back into our Constitution, to reaffirm that in our state, even those who are incarcerated should have the right to vote. Right now, again, it's a two-tiered system. And so there's a piece of legislation that's moving to amend the Constitution, and for the first time, it's 2023, in 23 years, that bill has actually been reported out of committee, which is a huge accomplishment. And as you can tell, I've moved away entirely from the script, so I will go back to some of my numbers. But I did want to share this because I thought this was very poignant. Young people are the ones who are doing this. If you look at the statistics, young people support this. Ages 18 to 27, voters in Massachusetts support restoring voting rights at a rate of 71%. Now, I'm sure none of you sitting here participated in this poll, but I will say that as it goes up in age, those numbers drop. To over 55, it goes to below 33%. So the argument that if we change this, we're not respecting the will of the voters neglects the fact that the voters are changing. And I think that that is important for us to remember. Same-day voter registration overwhelmingly impacts people who are younger, who are moving more regularly. Not solely, but primarily. It also affects people who are lower income and who are less housing secure because, again, they're moving more regularly. People who are supporting restoring voting rights, it's that same population. And that's why I chose these two issues to talk about today, because I think while you might look at them on paper, you don't think they actually go hand in hand. In many ways, they do. Because when we look at our incarcerated populations, we're also looking at people who are coming from certain communities in the state that are overpoliced, that are primarily low income, that are housing insecure, and let's face it, that are mostly Black and brown. So there are deep racial components that are at play in all of these issues. But these two primarily are the ways that the state could and yet hasn't stepped up to protect voting rights. Now, I know I have more statistics somewhere in here that I could share with you, and more ways that I could connect the issues, because originally when I sat down, I wanted to talk to you about so much more, and I also thought you probably don't want to sit here all day. But the ways that we can connect incarceration and environmental justice, because as was stated up here earlier, we're talking about the same communities, right? Housing insecurity, it all loops together. But if we don't protect the right to vote, if we don't protect the right to enfranchisement, if we don't ensure that every single person who can vote does, and that they learn that muscle and they flex it consistently, we're not going to fix any of those other problems, because we won't have a democracy anymore. And I don't think that any form of government other than a democracy is going to resolve the very pressing and serious issues that are before us. And so I will repeat, I don't think it's polarization, although that's serious. And I don't think it's partisanship, which is again serious. I think it's apathy. I think it's a fear that our government can't do the work. But our government can if we make it, because each and every one of us in this room is the government. That's what a democracy is. And I hope you'll remember that and take that with you today, and that you will all continue to use your power to spread those words and to inspire other people to use theirs. It's the only way we'll succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. We now have Elaine and Nick who are going to lead us in a song.
Hi. Thank you so much for those remarks. That was amazing. It was such a privilege to have you here with us. Look at all these over 55 people who, in fact, go against that stat. Nick Warren and I are about to lead you in a song with which almost everyone in this room is familiar. It's called This Land Is Your Land by Woody Guthrie. And many of you are familiar, will be familiar with the lyrics that we are going to sing, but a number of you will not be familiar with those lyrics. You probably will be familiar with the Golden Valley and the Diamond Deserts and the Endless Skyway, those lyrics. But in fact, a few years ago when I was writing an article that included this song as part of it, I wasn't able to actually get permission to print the lyrics that we're gonna sing, because the official lyrics to the song were all about those diamond deserts and those golden valleys. But in fact, Woody Guthrie wrote this song in protest. He had been listening over the radio to a very famous singer singing, "God bless America, land that I love, stand beside her and guide her in the night through the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies to the oceans wide without. God bless America, my home sweet home." So the whole thing was about, right? It was about mountains and prairies and God and home. And Woody, who had been dusted out of Western Oklahoma during the droughts in the 30s, and who had spent many a night in migrant farm workers' camps, watching poverty in the United States, really wanted to write another song. So this is the song that he wrote. And we're going to try and sing really loud because we're not mic'd up, but we're hoping to get lots of help from you all. loud as we can, so that those of you who are not familiar with these particular lyrics will hear them. Maybe be able to sing along. The sun was shining and I was strolling, and the wheat fields waving and the dust clouds rolling, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. In the square of the city, in the shadow of the steeple, by the relief office, I saw my people. As they're hungry, I start to whistle. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. Was a big hard wall there that tried to stop me, and a great big sign there said private property, but on the other side it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. Nobody living can try to stop me as I go walking down freedom's highway. Nobody living can make me turn back, 'cause this land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me.
Our closing words for today come from what will be our common read later this month, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. Whatever our way out of this mess, one thing is certain. This degree of inequality, this withdrawal of opportunity, this cold denial of basic needs, this endorsement of pointless suffering, by no American value is this situation justified. No moral code or ethical principle, no piece of scripture or holy teaching can be summoned to defend what we have allowed our country to become.
Stay. We're going to take questions from online as well. You can put them in the chat. And we will be, Dave, what are we going to start and give people a few minutes to? Okay. We'll pass out some index cards for people, and we also recognize some people need to leave. So we'll take a few minutes. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning.
Yeah, that's better. As opposed to up here. Thank you.
Hello again to everybody on Zoom. We invite everybody to stay on this Zoom meeting, and you will be able to listen and participate in the Q&A with Representative Lindsay Sabadosa. If you have a question, you are welcome to type the question into the chat, and somebody who is in person in the Great Hall will forward your question. Due to this special event today, we will not be having our regular breakout rooms for social time. We want to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity to engage with and learn from Lindsay Sabadosa.
Test, test, okay. I hope some of you stay for our question and answer and discussion. Susie McCrae, where are you? And Harriet Diamond, please raise your hands. Where's Harriet? Harriet, they are passing out index cards. I see they're very busy. So please take an index card and write large so we can read. We're going to alternate between the index card questions and questions on chat so we can include everybody on Zoom. We've got plenty of time, 45 minutes. So please get ready. I'll do a 30-second countdown. Yes, I am. Thank you, Paul. Okay. Actually, I'll do a 10-second countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Okay, everybody, please be seated and be ready for some fun and learning. Take your conversations outside if you want to keep talking. Oh, a great suggestion. Could you come up closer, please? Okay. Could you come up closer, please? Those of you who are coming up closer, what's your reason? No.
And I feel like I spoke a lot, so I don't know that I'll give more remarks now. So maybe we'll just dive into questions if that's okay with. Okay. Okay, so the first question, and I know that these are on note cards, and I know some of you said, could I just raise my hand? I don't care how you ask questions, just feel free to ask them, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. All right, so are there any other voter suppression activities we should be aware of in Massachusetts, and what can we do to counteract them? So absolutely there are. So I mentioned that the VOTES Act was passed in 2020, and it made mail-in voting permanent in the state. There are communities that are trying to opt out of the mail-in voting. I will say that we saw enormous improvement in voter turnout with mail-in voting. It could still be easier. So I think if you receive the application in the mail, you have to fill out the application and send it back. That's a little wonky. What we really wanted was just the ballot to go to people, and if the people got the ballot and sent it back, then they voted, and if they didn't, they could show up on election day and vote. Again, it's that whole question of what's easiest and most convenient. But some towns are trying to take mail-in voting away entirely. So I would say that it's important to sort of connect with groups that are watching this work in the state. Common Cause is the biggest one, and they have the list of what's happening in different communities and how to make sure we are protecting the vote. The other thing you see is the removal of drop boxes. Or drop boxes being put in very inconvenient locations. So I think those are probably the two biggest things we're seeing right now. But I would encourage you, and again, Common Cause is a great organization. The ACLU also does a lot of work around voting protection to become involved in both the same-day voter registration and the constitutional amendment, which I didn't say in my speech, but a constitutional amendment requires the legislature to vote on it twice in 2 separate sessions, and then it has to go back to the ballot. So there's quite a bit of organizing that will be required to bring us back to having full enfranchisement. And that would put us on the same level as Vermont, which is the only other state, although both California and New York are trying to do so as well. I feel badly, I don't know who asked the question, so I hope I answered it. Whoever asked it, is there, yeah, hi, Ruth, hi. Okay, great, all right, so, yes, Bill Diamond, where's Bill? There he is. Hi, so is there support for H 3237, an act establishing a moratorium on new gas system expansion? Now that is the Bud Williams legislation out of Springfield, is that right? No? Okay, all right, I think it is. So I'm not certain about this particular bill and what the temperature is on it. I will say that the House, so for those of you who don't know, the House and the Senate are in a little bit of a fight right now around all environmental issues. Last session, the House wanted to move something forward, the Senate said no, and now the chairs are arguing. But in good news, even though they're arguing, they're both holding hearings, they're just holding separate hearings for all of the bills. The argument has actually meant they're moving faster than they normally have in the past, so silver linings. What we're hearing from the House side is they very much want to put together a climate bill, and they want that to come through early. They did not like how late things went last session. This particular bill I've not heard about. I have heard, though, that, let's see, what is it? There is a gas-related bill that Lori Ehrlich used to file around clean energy and clean heat systems that they're trying to include in it. So there's probably good room for conversation because they are sort of right now pulling together the different pieces that they want. But I think, and that's just good information for you all to know, that if you have a bill that you think is really important, and it doesn't even have to be a bill or a bill number. It can be an idea. I mean, let's be honest. A lot of times we file all these bills, and in the end, they take 9 sentences from this bill and 12 sentences from this bill, and they put them all together into an omnibus bill. So the ideas are really more important than the bill number, who filed it, or what the name is. But this is the time to reach out to the chairs, and that's Jeff Roy in the House and Michael Barrett in the Senate, and to talk to them about what you'd like to see included. Is that good? All right. So let's see. So for same-day voter registration, what form of personal ID is acceptable? Yes, I've worked with released felons who struggle to obtain a driver's license for use in getting gainful employment and voter registration. So for same-day voter registration, I of course don't have the bill in front of me. However, there's a multitude of documents that would be acceptable, and so it would be a combination. So if you didn't have a valid Massachusetts driver's license, if you had a state ID, if you had a bill, if you had your birth certificate, a combination of those documents is what's most important. And for same-day registration, it's being able to show that where you've moved to is where you should be registered to vote, right? In Massachusetts, we now have, and we did this with the Votes Act, electronic election books that are supposed to be going to all of the communities, so we can see who, if you've been previously registered, right? And that's actually very easy to find out if someone has been registered to vote before. So we just need to know where you act, which establishes that you're a US citizen. That's the primary focus of that. But then it would show where do you live, and that's what we would need to move that registration. Was that your question? Great. Can you tell us about an act expanding access to the fossil fuel-free demonstration project? So Bill again, all right. So that piece of legislation came out of the climate bill that passed last session. And that bill created a pilot program for 10 communities in Massachusetts to decide that all future construction or large-scale renovation would have to be fossil fuel-free. Northampton tried to participate in this program and was shut out because we were not one of the first 10 communities to get in the door. In fact, I don't think any Western Massachusetts community made it in. 2 from the Vineyard did, though. So it's interesting just who's going to be included and who's not. So we filed legislation to try to expand that because there were so many other communities that wanted to participate and were told that they couldn't. So it's a little bit of an uphill fight, quite honestly, because the Department of Energy Resources has said, no, we want to see these first 10 communities. We want to see if it's successful. I will tell you, from the legislature's perspective, not me personally, but many others, one of the fears is maintaining affordability. So we don't want to have communities where, the housing that's built is very, very green, but no one can afford to live there unless they're very wealthy. And so we want to see a demonstration of also, can you keep affordability and green housing? I would argue you can, but the state is a little cautious about that right now. So it's an uphill battle, but we're going to keep pushing. Those are the note card questions I had. Are there 2 more? Okay. Why don't we do the one from the chat and then we'll go to the note card. Sure, so I believe we're talking about Mass Health clawbacks, and if you get anything in the chat that says otherwise, let me know. But there was, in prior legislation, the creation of this trust fund that would try to help that. So if you're on Mass Health and you pass away, or someone in your family passes away who is on Mass Health, the state goes after the assets so that you're paying back the state for everything that was spent on your health care. And I hope I'm getting the question right, let me know. It's highly punitive to people who are low income, which is the requirement for being on Mass Health. And Massachusetts has been asking for more assets than we have to We do have to do it somewhat because of federal regulations, but we've been doing more than is actually required. And so last session, we tried to change this by creating a trust fund, so to try to help people not lose all of accumulated wealth so that they can leave things to family members. And it was vetoed by the governor. We can't override that veto because we're in a new session. However, new legislation has been filed. I very much expect it will get attached to bills moving forward. And I believe Governor Healy is supportive, so that's all positive. Okay. Sure. All right. So Danielle, hi. Okay, so what is in the future for supporting people with disabilities? Well, I think actually one of the things that we just talked about does that, because the Mass Health clawback actually really negatively impacts people with disabilities. Because if you were on Mass Health, a lot of people are very afraid of staying on Mass Health for too long because it has a negative impact on their family's overall economic situation. And so that's something that we've been trying to argue with Mass Health. Like, you're encouraging people to not get care because they're afraid of what it could cost their loved ones. So I think that's really important. I think also there's so many ways I could answer your question. I'm gonna pick maybe one or two. I think there's also a lot of work for us to do around schools and how we're helping students with learning disabilities or with other disabilities in schools. So sometimes students with disabilities need to have paraprofessionals in schools. Sometimes they need to go to different districts because they can't get all the help that they need in the school where they grow up, where they're studying. And that's really expensive for school districts. It's really, really expensive. And so the district sometimes is in the challenging position of saying, we can't afford it. But on the other hand, the student deserves an education. And so is there a way for the state to step in and try to help there? And I would argue that there probably is a way that the state, much like we talked about a Mass Health Trust Fund, the state should have a fund so that districts can appropriately help students who need the extra help without putting a burden on communities, so that communities are trying to limit the amount of services they give that student. Because the only person really in the end that's getting hurt is the student, and they shouldn't be forced to be in the middle. But I'm happy to talk more if there's anything specific. Whoops. You gave me two, right? Oh, the Commission for Reparations. So I think the Commission for Reparations is interesting, and it's particularly interesting that it's a Senate bill. And who asked this question? There we go, there you are. All right, so I think it's interesting that it's a Senate bill, and next week, I'm actually going to it. Heather McGhee has been invited to come and speak to the Senate. So if you haven't read Heather McGhee's book, I would read it. I imagine you all read it as like a community read, didn't you? From the number of heads that are shaking. No, all right. Just a lot of readers. She makes an amazing case for reparations in her book, where she really talks about not only it being the right thing to do, but that how it actually benefits the entire United States economy, because you're helping to bring wealth to areas where it wasn't before, and that lifts all boats. And I think her argument is interesting and powerful, and not necessarily the ones that we see on those like 20-minute news clips when people are arguing about things. So I think it's really fascinating. The Senate president has invited Heather McGhee to talk to the Senate, which gives me more hope for your bill. Honestly, before that invitation, I'm not sure I would have known how to answer your question. I think, most legislators will say if local communities want to do that, that's great. But I do think that's a twinkling of hope. Yeah, of course. Of course.
Thank you. Please. Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest.
All right, questions
and
from the floor.
I was going to suggest that people come up here on the road.
Do you want me to just hand over the mic?
Yeah. Yes. My question was, so this is June 2023, on what's the likely path for passage for the same-day voter registration? What's the likelihood it will get done this year or next year?
So one of the reasons I wanted to bring up same-day voter registration is that it's the hardest lift in the State House. And it's the hardest lift because there are some legislators, feel free to laugh if you want, who have a lot of college students in their district. Now, I will say that's no one from Western Massachusetts. I'm not calling out anyone. I know UMass Amherst is up the road. That's not who I mean. But there are some legislators who have a lot of college students in their district, and they're very fearful that same-day registration could tilt elections, and they don't like the unpredictability of it. So, what they're saying is, okay, the election is scheduled June 5th, September 5th, and a lot of students move on to campus August 31st. Someone who organizes could, in theory, tilt the election to one candidate or the other. Now, my argument, and I imagine probably yours, is that that's democracy. So yes, that that can happen, and that's okay. I mean, it's not great to lose an election, but it happens, especially if you're not necessarily representing your constituents. So it's a harder lift. However, I do think we're going to get there. But that's why it's so important for people to really engage on the topic, because in the legislature, if you don't hear anything about an issue, you kind of think people don't care. Right? And so the more engagement we have, the better.
I say this because this feels a little bit self-indulgent. I want to thank you. We are neighbors. I live within a short walk of both you and Joe Comerford's house, I understand. And I realize that I have been accepting the brilliance of the Bay State contingent in the State House like water and air, which I understand also we can't really take for granted. So thank you so much. My husband even writes a little check, but it's really great to have you here to remind us that we often think, I think, in federal terms, and think that preserving our democracy here in Massachusetts is also, it's also fragile, it also needs doing, and then it is an example, I think, to the rest of the country. I have relatives who are represented in Congress by Chip Roy and Kevin McCarthy. So, we talk about that a lot, but this is two really quick picks. One is, I have young colleagues, I work at Smith College, some temporary employees. Are we thinking about ever making the registry available to people who work? They need to take time off during their workday. There are no evening hours, there are no weekend hours. It just seems nuts to me. So I'm sure we all agree about this, but it really impacts people with fewer means. The other thing, and I know that Heather McGee says, I've been told, because I haven't gotten that far in the book, sees this as an equity issue, but I have not been for my swim at the DAR ever when a child from Springfield or Holyoke has not approached me and told me they want to learn to swim. And I see that the DCR offers swimming lessons at state beaches, and none of them are in Western Massachusetts. Just another way that living in South Vermont disadvantages us. But it's great to have those open, and I'm really thinking about those children.
Well, thank you. So the RMV is the bane of my existence. You do mean the RMV? Yes. No, you said, I thought you meant they are the bane of my existence. So they are very difficult, very, very, very difficult to work with. And that's an improvement over the past few years. I think they would tell you that they've made a lot of things accessible online. And that's their solution to people who have to work. So I have an office at 76 Gothic. We're just down the road, just from down the courthouse. And I can't tell you the number of people who come to my office because they do not have a computer at home. If they do have a computer at home, they don't know how to access the RMV's website. Or they've tried to do all of those things multiple times and they still aren't successful. And so we come in and walk them through that and then get the RMV on the phone and complain to them if we can't get all of their documentation done. But it is very challenging. I don't know about the expanded hours. It's honestly, post-pandemic, been just kind of a victory to get them to reopen. We had a moment where we didn't think they'd reopen everywhere in the state, but it's certainly something that we could press on because, I mean, you could switch, right? Like the hour, it could open later on one day and stay open later, but I think that that would actually be very, very useful, so it's a good point. The DCR swimming lessons and lack of swimming lessons in Western Massachusetts is a thing that bothers me greatly. I will say, this is not about swimming lessons, but the flip side of it is I also find it frustrating that DCR tries to apply some of the Eastern Mass rules to Western Massachusetts. If you're going to the DCR in Goshen, it is not the same as going to Walden Pond in Concord. It's just different. Well, we're just a little different, and that should be okay. But DCR is very difficult about that. But yet the swimming lessons, I think probably because they can't find staff at all. They can't, if you do know anyone, primarily in Eastern Massachusetts, who wants to be a lifeguard or teach swimming lessons, they are incredibly short-staffed, and that's been true. But I do wonder, I mean, like, the Y offers these programs, so maybe there's a way to find some sort of local collaboration. I will think on that. Move over here.
Thank you. I'm Jan Nedler. I'm just wondering about end-of-life issues and the legislature doing something about that.
So the question again was about end-of-life issues, and I think the legislature is getting ready. I think that we have more momentum around the issue than we've had in a very long time. As you know, it did go to the ballot in Massachusetts and get voted down. When that happens, it makes it very hard for the legislature to do anything for quite a while surrounding the issue. However, we've kind of passed that 10-year mark at this point, and there's a lot of momentum in favor, as well as surrounding states that are starting to implement, so we're able to see that. I believe Vermont has said people from out of state can come as well and use, yeah. So I think when you have a situation like that, the state is likely to act, if only to put up guardrails to make sure that people are just not flooding to Vermont, which I don't think would look positively on the legislature. So I think we'll see momentum. Yep, one over here. Oh, 1, 2, okay.
Could you just briefly address abortion access? Our governor was, I thought, was very bold in making statements saying that anybody from anywhere in the country could come and that they would be protected. And I just don't know where, I haven't followed it closely enough to know where that stands and if there's things that we can do or if there's any legislation coming up that will protect that.
So I can answer your question, but I'm going to struggle to be brief. So yes, Massachusetts passed, we've passed something that's called a SHIELD law. And I think we are at, I've lost count. I do have a count of the number of states who've passed SHIELD laws. Nevada was the last one. And Nevada passed it, even though their governor does not believe in abortion because he said it was the right thing to do. So it was heartwarming. The SHIELD law in Massachusetts protects physicians, patients, nurses, midwives, doulas, abortion funds, you name it, from prosecution for engaging or providing abortion services. That bill was really important to me because, as I was saying, when we take pieces of bills and stick them in others, several pieces of bills I spent a lot of time working on were within that. So Massachusetts is moving forward in a variety of ways. We eliminated copays and deductibles. That was my part in that, so I'm very happy that it's less expensive for people to obtain care. The other part of my work that got included was expanding medication abortion to public college campuses. So that allowed us, in the weird ways in which the world works, that created a fund, which is what we used to put in state dollars in order to stockpile mifepristone. So no matter what comes out of the Supreme Court, Massachusetts will continue to have access, which is, I think, critical in the days and weeks moving forward. We feel secure in that. In terms of work that's moving forward, we are trying to do implementation on all campuses. So that's been interesting in that there's sort of like a guidebook that's been published now, that's about to be published, that explains how to offer services if you want to become a provider, which is really, I think, important work. One of the things that we need to recognize is that we need more providers, because we need more providers in general in every area of healthcare, but we need more people who are currently physicians and nurses and midwives to also offer abortion services. Because we're seeing so many people come in from out of state, it's leading to backlogs and delays for a service that really can't be delayed. In terms of the work that's sort of pending in the State House, there were a couple pieces that we left on the table with the Roe Act and with the Reproductive Rights Act of 2022, in that we changed the rules around gestational limits. And this is really wonky, but I'm going to say it anyway because there's a key part that I need you to take away from it. So in Massachusetts, you can have an abortion up to 24 weeks unless the life of the pregnant person or the fetus is in jeopardy, and in which case there are other provisions. So sort of those things you're hearing other states discuss within their bans. In Massachusetts, however, we changed the wording because we found that, and I think other states that are creating exceptions are going to find this, no matter what you say, it just doesn't work. So we had patients who were being forced to travel out of state because the hospital said, well, I mean, it's 85% chance that this is fatal, but maybe it's like there's a 15% chance it's not. So like, are we liable? And how do we decide, and who decides? And so the easy answer was, we'll send the patient out of state, and then the patient can come back and get the rest of their care. We changed it so that it didn't say fatal, it said severe, which we thought would help. But the truth is we're still sending patients out of state because hospitals are very conservative in their read. Attorneys are very conservative in their read of the law. So there has to be work done around education about what this really means and making sure that hospitals and hospital boards feel safe and secure in offering services here. It is my goal that no one in Massachusetts ever has to travel out of state for healthcare, no matter what kind it is. So that's some of the work that still needs to be done. I will say, just because it's the thing that I'm working on every day now, we are also trying to, and this is contraception, but we are trying to ensure that pharmacists can prescribe contraception. It would make Massachusetts the 19th state to do it, and that bill is coming up for a hearing on Tuesday. So that's exciting.
I also want to thank you for coming today. So it's been very enriching for all of us. Could you speak to what the state is looking at, as David talked about in his reading about healthcare disparity in the state and climate change and how that's affecting people and what the state can do about that? Your question is so big and there is so much, I'm not entirely sure where to start with it. So just first, right off the bat, there is a piece of legislation that was filed that tries to look at exactly that, the impact of climate change, and particularly in environmental justice communities and where healthcare disparities are arising. So we're just we have data from COVID that shows us that to great extent, but I think COVID made it easier for people to acknowledge that in some strange way, where there was really like oh wow, like the number of deaths and disease in these particular communities is so much higher, and why is that? And so following this pandemic, I think people are really interested to understand, how does that affect other diseases? I know there's work being done right now around cancer and communities that are around airports and other like areas of high areas of concentration of transportation, and what that looks like. So all of that to say, there are lots of little bills that are looking at it, and there is a lot of desire to do a larger healthcare bill. I've said a few times we don't have enough providers, and that there was just last week, it was not even last week, it was still this week, 2 days ago, a healthcare provider in the South Shore just closed entirely, leaving thousands and thousands of patients without any healthcare. And I think we're all afraid that's going to happen and kind of keep rolling throughout the state. So because of that, there is a lot of desire to do something. And I think you're going to see a connection in that healthcare bill with environmental justice communities and how climate change is playing a role in our health. Yeah.
So I sent you an email on this. This is the Act on Mass Sunlight program. You want me to refresh your memory with the 4 bills? Okay.
Great. So there is a group in the state called Act on Mass that works to try to make government more transparent and easy for people to understand. And they have 4 pieces of legislation that deal with expanding access to committee votes, with public record requests, and open meeting law. So they're all, none of these are new bills. They've been around for a long time. It's a great agenda. I don't think it's an agenda that's likely to pass anytime soon because of some of the complexities. And I just think that there's not a lot of appetite, quite frankly. But they are all really good pieces of legislation, and you should take a look at them. You can write to me about any piece you want at any point. I think I've signed on to it. If I haven't, so just so you know this too, and if I'm not your legislator and someone else is, at this point in the session, if someone hasn't opened the bill to co-sponsorship, we have to click request, which means the other person has to go in and accept the request. So sometimes people say to me, you haven't co-sponsored, and I'm like, no, I did, they just haven't accepted it. So just as a warning, sometimes things aren't always as they seem, which I think is the point of the legislation. But, you can certainly write to me. I believe I've co-sponsored or am pending co-sponsorship. So, I'm happy to get those emails. Beyond that, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen in committee. I think that they have very good intentions. Like any group that is not part of the legislature, it's very hard. I would like to talk so much about this. It's very hard to understand all of the inner workings, and so sometimes there's an oversimplification of what happens. I'm just going to cite another. I read a lot, so I just read this book called Gucci Gulch. It's actually, I think it was published in like 1985 or 1986, and it was an in-depth analysis of how Congress passed tax reform. So someone had pitched it to me as, look at, this was a time where Reagan was president, but the Democrats held Congress, and they were able to do this great thing. And so you read the book, and you're like, yeah, this is a lot of people taking credit for doing something good, but there's probably a little bit more. And then at the end, what's fascinating is, again, the book was published in 1985, when you look at the analysis of what tax reform did, it didn't do anything. So, like, it was this great bipartisan accomplishment, but 10 years later, it had no effect. Exactly. So I think, sometimes when you're outside of the building, it's like, oh, this was a great thing, this was a bad thing. But you have to really, it's the long term that matters. And so it's always a little hard for, I think, any group to be fully aware of all of the politics and the process that goes on. Because it's complicated. I'm still learning, and this is year 5.
Well, that gives me an opportunity to say how grateful we are that you share the depth and breadth of your knowledge, because it is really hard to figure that out. Okay, Lindsay has another obligation, and the CAG meeting starts now. So if there's nothing else, I think we're about done.